By the time the ship reached Southampton, Miss Adelaide Munro had already decided two things. First, that England smelled far too damp for a country so certain of its superiority. And second, that she would not allow herself to be grateful. This was important. Gratitude, she had learned, was often mistaken for obligation. She stood at the rail with her gloved hands folded neatly together, watching the coastline appear through a stubborn veil of mist. It was not dramatic exactly. England did not announce itself. It merely waited, as though confident she would come to it eventually. Adelaide supposed that was fitting. She was 26, American, and very wealthy. Those facts were usually announced before she even entered a room. In New York, they were said with interest. In Boston, with calculation. She had been told, in a variety of careful phrases, that in England they would be said with relief. An heiress, after all, was most useful before she had time to notice how she was being appraised. She straightened her shoulders as the ship slowed, refusing the small knot of nerves that threatened to form. She had crossed an ocean. She had negotiated her own future with men who believed they were doing her a favor by allowing her to do so. She would not tremble now because of a little fog and a country estate she had not yet seen. Behind her, a woman murmured something about the weather. Adelaide did not turn. She had learned long ago that people spoke more freely when they thought one was not listening. "She does not look like the others," the woman continued, lowering her voice. Adelaide smiled faintly. That was true enough. The others were very specific. Tall, narrow, pale as porcelain figurines, and just as delicate-looking. Adelaide was not delicate. She had never been described as such, not even by her fondest aunt. She was soft where other women were sharp, solid where others were slight. Her figure had been called handsome, generous, and once, by a well-meaning dressmaker, substantial. She did not mind. She had learned how to carry herself so that people noticed her posture before anything else. A gentleman approached the rail a few steps away. He glanced at her, then away again with practiced politeness. Adelaide catalogued the look automatically. Quick, assessing, finished. That too was familiar. She would be met at the docks by representatives of the family she was to marry into. There would be tea and polite conversation and a drive through countryside that would be described to her as picturesque. Somewhere along the way, someone would decide whether she was suitable. Adelaide had agreed to this arrangement with her eyes open. Titles were not purchased cheaply, even when one had the funds to do so. She understood the terms. She would bring American money. They would bring English legitimacy. It was a transaction that had worked many times before. Still, as the gangway was lowered and the hum of disembarkation began, she felt something she had not expected. Not fear, unease. It crept in quietly, without asking permission. A sense that she had stepped into a room where a conversation had already begun, and that she was not meant to hear all of it. When her name was called, Adelaide turned smoothly, lifting her chin just a fraction. She smiled as she always did. Pleasantly, carefully, without invitation. Whatever England intended to make of her, she would meet it standing, and if they found her wanting, well, she had not crossed an ocean to disappear politely. The house, when they arrived, was exactly as Adelaide had been told it would be. Large, respectable, entirely unimpressed by her presence. She took this in with calm acceptance as she handed her gloves to a footman who did not quite look at her face. The hallway smelled faintly of beeswax and restraint. Portraits of long-dead ancestors lined the walls, their expressions uniformly disapproving, as though they had been consulted in advance and found her lacking. If nothing else, England was consistent. Tea was served in a drawing room that appeared designed to make conversation feel like a test one had not studied for. Adelaide sat precisely where she was directed, her spine straight, her hands folded. She answered questions easily. Yes, the voyage had been pleasant. Yes, America was thriving. No, she had never been to England before. She smiled at the appropriate intervals and did not speak more than necessary. She was, she knew, doing everything correctly. The groom, Mr. Henry Ashcombe, arrived 10 minutes late. This was not in itself alarming. Men were often late. What caught her attention was the hesitation in his step when he saw her. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But Adelaide noticed such things. She had learned, too. He was pleasant enough after that. Polite, mildly charming. He asked her about the journey, about New York, about whether she preferred the city or the countryside. She answered, and he nodded, and something in his expression suggested that he was listening with one ear while the other was occupied elsewhere, evaluating. When tea concluded, she was invited to walk in the gardens. It was there, surrounded by hedges trimmed into obedience and flowers that bloomed precisely where they were told, that the atmosphere shifted. Mr. Ashcombe cleared his throat. "Miss Munro," he began, stopping beside a marble bench. Adelaide turned to face him fully. She waited. "I trust you understand," he said carefully, "that these arrangements require a certain harmony." She inclined her head. "Of course." He nodded, relieved as though she had spared him an inconvenience. "My family has always placed great importance on, well, appearances." That word again. She had heard it in Boston, in Newport, in drawing rooms where women were discussed like investments. "Naturally," she replied. There was a pause. Too long. He did not look at her directly when he spoke next. "It has been decided that this match may not be suitable." Ah, there it was. Adelaide felt the moment land with surprising clarity. No rush of heat, no sting behind the eyes. Just a cool, settling understanding. She waited. He seemed to expect something, perhaps tears, or argument, or confusion. When none came, he pressed on, visibly uncomfortable. "You are, of course, an exceptional young woman," he said, in the tone men used when they meant the opposite, "but my family feels, quite strongly, that a different sort of lady would better align with our expectations." Adelaide smiled. It was not a large smile. It did not invite sympathy. It was the smile she used when she wished to remind people that she was listening, not pleading. "I see," she said. He exhaled, relieved. "I'm grateful you understand." Grateful. She wondered briefly what he would have done if she had not. They returned to the house together. Word traveled quickly. By the time she reached the drawing room again, she could feel it in the air. The subtle shift, the recalibration, pity from some, satisfaction from others. A few glances lingered longer than politeness allowed. Adelaide stood, smoothing the silk of her skirts over her substantial frame with a deliberate, cool calm. She looked at the Ashcombes, at their narrow faces and their narrowing lives, and felt a sudden, sharp burst of pity, not for herself, but for them. "Then I shall not stay to disturb the harmony of a house that clearly cannot afford the noise," she said softly. She turned and walked out. She did not look back. She did not wait for a carriage to be called. She simply stepped into the hallway, collected her own cloak, and walked out of the heavy oak doors. The English rain was waiting for her, cold and relentless. She climbed into the Ashcombe carriage, the very one that had brought her here with such hope. "To London," she commanded the driver, her voice like iron. "And do not stop until we are far beyond these gates." The carriage door clicked shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. As the horses lurched forward, Adelaide watched through the rain-streaked glass as the estate vanished into a grey blur. She was 37, she was alone, and she was currently the greatest failure in her family's history. But as the wheels gained speed toward the city and the first wisps of the great fog began to lick at the windows, Adelaide realized she didn't feel broken. She felt lighter. The harmony of the Ashcombes had been a cage, and the storm outside was the first thing that had felt like home in weeks. Adelaide didn't lean back and sob. Instead, she reached for the small leather travel desk tucked into the seat pocket, her fingers steady despite the swaying of the carriage. She ignored the way her impeccable auburn hair was beginning to frizz from the damp. She had a much more pressing matter to attend to. She dipped her pen, the inkwell rattling against the wood as the horses gained speed. On a fresh sheet of parchment she wrote with the sharp, decisive strokes of a woman who knew the value of $1 and the cost of an insult. Father, the Ashcombes are a small people living in a large house they can no longer afford. They have found the Munro name unsuitable. I do not want your comfort, and I certainly do not want an apology. I want the deeds. Contact the London and County Bank immediately. Buy their mortgage. Buy the land. Buy every brick of this harmonious estate. I want to own the roof over their heads before they even realize I've reached London. She pressed her signet ring into the hot wax, the Munro crest gleaming in the dim carriage light. She wasn't just a rejected bride anymore. She was a woman making an acquisition. The montage of Adelaide's departure was a blur of damp stations and iron-grey skies. She had expected London to be a sanctuary, a place where her wealth could build a wall between her and the sting of the Ashcombes' rejection. But London in 1895 had other plans. By the time her carriage reached the heart of the city, the great fog had descended, a pea souper so thick and yellow it swallowed the street lamps whole. It wasn't just weather, it was a wall of soot and sulphur that turned the world into a blind man's maze. "I can't see the horse's ears, miss," her driver shouted, his voice muffled by the heavy air. "We'll have to stop." "We cannot stop in the middle of the street," Adelaide called back, pulling her collar up. "Find a curb, find a—" Crack! The sound was followed by a jolt that sent Adelaide flying off her seat. Outside, there was the scream of a horse and the shouting of men. Adelaide scrambled out of the carriage. The fog was a living thing, damp and tasting of coal. 2 paces away, her carriage had collided with a sleek black brougham that had been emerging from a side street. Both vehicles were locked together, wheels splintered. "Are you quite finished destroying my evening? Or is there a second act to this performance?" The voice came out of the yellow gloom, deep, bored, and impossibly aristocratic. Adelaide turned toward the sound. A man stepped forward, a handkerchief held to his face against the smog. Even in the dim light of a dying carriage lamp, he was striking. He wasn't the pleasant sort of man like Henry. He was all sharp angles and cold authority. This was the Earl of Sterling. He lowered the handkerchief, and his gaze swept over her. Most men in the ton looked at Adelaide and saw a dollar princess who was a bit too large for their tastes. Sterling looked at her and saw something else entirely. His eyes didn't linger on her waist. They snapped to her eyes, which were currently flashing with American fury. "My driver was on the correct side of the road, my lord," Adelaide snapped. She gestured toward the door of her own wrecked vehicle, where the light of a lantern caught the gilded Ashcombe crest, a hawk clutching a withered branch. Sterling paused, his eyes flicking to the crest and then back to her face. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. "The Ashcombe hawk," he murmured. "And an American accent. I take it you are the dollar princess the clubs have been gossiping about. You must be Miss Munro." Adelaide's breath hitched. "I am, though I didn't realize I was public property." "You are wealthy and foreign. You were never going to be anything else," Sterling said, stepping closer. He glanced at the carriage, then at the direction she was traveling. "But seeing you here, alone in the fog at midnight, gives the distinct impression that things did not go well in the countryside. The Ashcombes are a picky, difficult people, Miss Munro. I suspect you might not be the first lady to find their hospitality lacking." The sting of his guess was fresh, but Adelaide didn't flinch. "I found their requirements for harmony to be rather restrictive, my lord." "I can imagine," Sterling murmured. He reached out, not to touch her, but to catch a stray auburn curl that had escaped her hat. He let his hand drop before he made contact, but the tension in the air was thicker than the fog. "But here is the difficulty. If you are found standing in the street at midnight with a man of my reputation, the Ashcombes' opinion will be the least of your worries. The entire world will be talking." A police whistle shrilled in the distance. The law was coming to document the accident. In 1895, an heiress found unchaperoned in a stranger's carriage path during a pea super was a ruined woman. "Get in my carriage," Sterling commanded. "Now." "I most certainly will not." "Miss Munro." He cut her off, his voice dropping an octave as he used her name with a weight that made her skin prickle. "You can be a victim of a scandal, or you can be the author of one. Choose." "Now." The police lanterns are glowing through the mist just yards away. If she stays, she's the rejected girl in a wreck. If she gets in his carriage, she's a scandalous woman with an Earl. The door of Sterling's brougham slammed shut, sealing out the sulphurous chill of the London fog. Inside, the world was reduced to the scent of expensive leather, the faint aroma of the Earl's sandalwood soap, and a silence so heavy it felt physical. Adelaide sat as far from him as the small space allowed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been rejected at 3 o'clock for the crime of taking up too much space, and by 10, she was trapped in a box with a man who looked like he'd been carved from the very shadows they were driving through. "You speak as though we are characters in a penny dreadful, my lord," Adelaide said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "It was a carriage accident. I fail to see why you are treating it as a matter of state. In London, Miss Munro, a carriage accident involving an unchaperoned heiress and a man with my particular history is a matter of state," Sterling replied. He sat across from her, his long legs nearly brushing her silk skirts. Even in the shadows, his sharp features and smooth jawline seemed to catch what little light filtered through the silk curtains. "You knew the Ashcombes business," she challenged. "Do you make it a habit to study the ledgers of American strangers?" Sterling leaned forward. "I make it a habit to know when a predator is about to swallow a prize they don't deserve. The Ashcombes have been boasting for weeks at White's about the dollar princess who would save their crumbling roof. But seeing you here, alone, I suspect you found their requirements for harmony to be rather restrictive." Adelaide flinched, the echoes of Henry's insults about her figure still ringing in her ears. "I am aware I do not fit the English mould of a lady. I am substantial, my lord. Solid. I assume that is why they decided I was unsuitable. The Ashcombes wouldn't know beauty if it bit them on the nose," Sterling remarked dryly. He didn't look away. Unlike Henry, who had looked at her with a sort of polite alarm, Sterling looked at her with a terrifyingly focused appreciation. They wanted a doll they could ignore. They found a woman instead. Someone with enough presence to actually fill a room. Naturally, they are terrified. The carriage jolted, throwing Adelaide toward him. Sterling's hand shot out, steadying her by the elbow. The contact was brief. The heat of his palm through her cloak was electric, but he didn't pull away immediately. "You have a choice, Adelaide," he whispered. "In 20 minutes we reach Mayfair. I can drop you at a hotel where the Ashcombes lies will follow you by morning. Or you can come with me to Gillingham House. My aunt is the most formidable woman in England. If she accepts you, the Ashcombes are not just liars, they are social outcasts." Adelaide looked at his hand on her arm. This was the moment of no return. "And why would your aunt accept a woman like me? One who arrived at midnight in your carriage?" Sterling's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. "Because she has a profound weakness for anyone who manages to make the ton lose its collective mind." The carriage slows as the fog thins, revealing the bright, judgmental lights of Mayfair. Ahead, the grand entrance of Gillingham House looms. "Decide," Sterling urged. "Are we going to be a scandal, or are we going to be a masterpiece?" The carriage came to a halt before a massive stone edifice in Mayfair. Gillingham House did not merely stand, it loomed, its windows glowing with a low, judgmental light that seemed to pierce through the remaining tatters of the great fog. "The hour is late, Sterling," Adelaide whispered, her breath hitching as the footman opened the carriage door. "Your aunt will be in her nightclothes. She will think I am... Well, she will think exactly what a woman found in your carriage at midnight usually is." "My aunt has not worn nightclothes before 2 a.m. since the death of the Prince Consort," Sterling replied, stepping out and offering a hand. And she stopped caring what people think 40 years ago. That is the secret to her power. I suggest you learn it quickly." Adelaide took his hand, her silk skirts rustling, a heavy, expensive sound that seemed to echo in the quiet street. She straightened her spine, smoothing the front of her traveling bodice. She was a Monroe. She was substantial, and if she was to be judged, she would be judged standing tall. They were led through a hallway that smelled of beeswax, old roses, and ancient authority. In the drawing room, seated in a high-backed chair that looked more like a throne, was the Dowager Countess of Gillingham. She was a woman made of lace, iron, and a very sharp pair of spectacles. She didn't look up from her embroidery as they entered. "You're late, Sterling," the Countess remarked, her voice like the dry crack of parchment. "And you smell of sulphur and bad intentions. I assume the woman behind you is the reason for both." "Aunt, may I present Miss Adelaide Monroe of New York?" Sterling said, his tone perfectly bored, though Adelaide felt the heat of his gaze on her. "She had a disagreement with a ditch and a family of hooks. I found her to be a much more interesting centerpiece for your drawing room than the porcelain shepherdess you usually keep on the mantel." The Countess finally looked up. Her eyes were like flint, scanning Adelaide from her mud-flecked hem to the defiant tilt of her head. The silence lasted a heartbeat too long. "She is larger than the girls you usually drag home, Sterling," the Countess said bluntly. Adelaide felt the familiar sting, the echo of Henry's rejection, but before she could speak, the Countess continued, "Good. Most of the girls in London look like they'd snap in a stiff breeze. A woman should look like she can carry the weight of a title without fainting." She narrowed her eyes at Adelaide. "Tell me, Miss Monroe, are you here for the Earl's protection, or are you here because you've realized that being rejected by an Ashcombe is the highest compliment you could ever receive?" Adelaide stepped forward. She didn't curtsy. "I am here, my lady, because I have discovered that London is much like New York. A city full of people who confuse slightness with significance. I have no need for protection. I'm merely looking for a room with a better view." The Dowager's lips didn't move, but her eyes sparked. "Wit. I suppose we must thank the Americans for something." She turned to Sterling. "She stays in the blue suite. And Sterling, do try to be discreet. If the Ashcombes find out she's here before we've had a chance to dress her in something that makes them weep with regret, I shall be very cross with you." As Sterling led Adelaide toward the stairs, he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "You passed the first test," he whispered, "but the Ashcombes are already writing their letters. By morning the gossip will be out. Do you know how to waltz, Adelaide? Because tomorrow night we're going to dance on their graves." The morning light in the blue suite was far too bright for a woman who had spent half the night in a fog-bound carriage. Adelaide sat at the mahogany writing desk, her pen hovering over the letter she had started in the carriage, the one addressed to her father in New York. She wasn't writing a plea for home anymore. She was adding a final, brutal postscript. "The bank must move quickly. I want the deeds in my hand before the Ashcombes can even draft an apology. Let them find out who their new landlord is when it is too late to pray." She was folding the paper when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Sterling didn't wait for an answer before strolling in. He looked impossibly refreshed, dressed in a crisp morning coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His gaze dropped immediately to the desk, landing on the heavy gold Monroe signet ring resting beside the inkwell. "Writing your surrender to your father, I see," he remarked, his striking blue eyes meeting hers with a knowing glint. Adelaide's hand stilled. She stood, smoothing her silk dressing gown over her curves, her sharp features narrowing. "And how, my lord, did you arrive at the conclusion that this is a surrender, or that it is even addressed to my father?" Sterling leaned against the bedpost, his expression buoyant and entirely too clever. He gestured lazily toward the desk. "Firstly, because the Monroe signet ring is currently leaving a very distinctive mark in that red wax. And secondly," he stepped closer, his voice dropping, "because you have the posture of a soldier writing to her general. There is a certain weight to your pen stroke that one does not waste on a distant cousin or a dressmaker. You are reporting a disaster to your commanding officer." Adelaide tucked the letter away, hiding the text from his view. "It is not surrender, my lord. It is a strategic consolidation. I have no desire to stay where I am mocked without a proper defense. And I have no desire to let the most interesting woman in London slip away because a few country squires have poor eyesight," Sterling countered. He stepped into her space, his presence filling the room. "You've already written to him. How very efficient of you. I am an American, Sterling. We do not linger where we are not wanted. But what if you are wanted?" He looked up, his gaze intense. "Not as a bank account, and not as a dollar princess, but as the woman who made the Dowager Countess of Gillingham laugh for the first time in a decade?" He moved closer, the scent of sandalwood and cold morning air clinging to him. He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of the letter in her hand. "The Ashcombes are telling the Ton that you are fleeing because you couldn't handle the pressure of English society. If you get on that boat, you prove them right. You become a footnote in their history." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "Stay, Adelaide, stay, and let me show them that a Monroe doesn't withdraw. She dominates." Adelaide looked at the letter, the financial weapon she was about to send across the Atlantic. Then at the man who was offering her a stage for her revenge. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, intoxicating spark of hope. "And what of my family? They expect word from me." "Then send that letter," Sterling whispered, his face inches from hers. "Tell them you've decided to stay for the season. Tell them you found a reason to endure the English fog after all." Adelaide looked at the letter, then signaled for the footman at the door. She didn't tell Sterling about the deeds or the bank. She simply handed the envelope over with a look of iron. "See that this is sent urgently," she commanded. "It must reach the telegraph office for the Atlantic line before the morning is out." As the footman hurried away, she turned back to Sterling. "I shall need a new dress," she said, her voice breathy but determined. Sterling's smile was triumphant, his clean-shaven jaw tightening with a laugh. "I've already sent for the modiste. And Adelaide, we aren't making you a lady, we're making you a legend." The modiste's salon was brought to Gillingham House, but it was Sterling who directed the theatre. Adelaide stood on a low pedestal, surrounded by oceans of silk and lace, while Madame Duchamp hovered with a measuring tape. Adelaide kept her gaze fixed on the wall, her jaw set. She was used to being measured and found too much. She expected the tisking sounds, the suggestions of dark colors, to minimize her presence, and the heavy corsetry intended to crush her into a shape she wasn't meant to be. "No black," Sterling's voice rang out from the doorway. He walked into the room, his eyes raking over the bolts of fabric with a discerning, hungry intensity. "And no grey. She's not a shadow, madame. Stop trying to hide her." "But, my lord," the modiste tutted, "the current fashion for the more substantial silhouette is too—" "The current fashion is boring," Sterling interrupted. He stepped up to the pedestal, reaching out to grab a bolt of heavy, shimmering emerald silk. He draped it over Adelaide's shoulder, his knuckles brushing the sensitive skin of her neck. He stayed there, his body inches from hers, forcing her to look at him in the mirror. "Look at yourself, Adelaide," he whispered, his voice raw and stripped of its usual boredom. "Stop looking for the parts of you that you think shouldn't be there. Look at the strength of your shoulders. Look at the way that color makes your eyes look like a storm at sea." Adelaide's breath hitched. In the mirror, she didn't see a dollar princess or a rejected bride. She saw a woman who looked like she could command an army. Sterling's hand moved down, his palm flat against the silk covering her waist, not to measure, but to possess the space. The honesty in his eyes was brutal. He wasn't being kind. He was being truthful. "I've spent my life being told I'm a problem to be solved," Adelaide said, her voice a low, intimate tremor. "Then you have been listening to fools," Sterling replied. He turned to the modiste, his eyes flashing with a sudden, high-stakes authority. "I want the neckline low and the skirt structured." "We aren't going to disguise her, madame. We are going to frame her. She's going to the Ashcombe ball, and I want every man in that room to realize that while they were looking for a bird in a cage, they missed the chance to capture a goddess." He stepped back, but the heat of his presence remained, a physical mark on her skin. He looked at the emerald silk, then back at her, a dangerous promise written in the sharp lines of his face. Adelaide looked at the shimmering fabric, and then at the door, thinking of the letter she had shredded. She realized then that she wasn't staying for revenge anymore. She was staying because for the first time in 37 years, a man was looking at her and seeing everything he had ever wanted without asking her to be a single inch less. The modiste began to pin the silk, the sharp metal clicking against the floor, but all Adelaide could hear was the blood rushing in her ears as she realized that when she walked into that ballroom, she wouldn't just be breaking the Ashcombes' hearts. She would be risking her own. The morning after the modiste's visit, the atmosphere in Gillingham House had shifted from a quiet sanctuary to a fortress under siege. It began with the arrival of the morning papers and the delivery of a dozen cream-colored calling cards, none of which were intended for the dowager. They were for the mystery guest who had arrived in the Earl's carriage during the Great Fog. In London, secrets didn't just leak. They bled through the walls of every exclusive club and drawing room until the air itself felt heavy with the scent of a fresh kill. Adelaide stood by the tall, arched windows of the library, watching the street below. Carriages slowed as they passed the house, their occupants leaning out for a glimpse of the scandal. She felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her chest, the same one that had tightened every time a New York society matron had whispered about her unfortunate size. But this was different. This wasn't just about her figure. This was about her virtue. In 1895, a woman found unchaperoned with the wicked Earl at midnight was a woman whose future was written in ash. They looked like vultures circling a battlefield. She said softly as the door behind her opened. Sterling didn't answer immediately. He walked to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry, his movements languid and utterly devoid of the panic Adelaide felt. He crossed the room, handing her a glass. His fingers brushed hers, a deliberate, slow contact that sent a jolt of raw heat up her arm. He didn't pull away. He stood close, his tall, lean frame casting a shadow over her that felt more like a shield than a threat. "Vultures only circle things that are already dead," Sterling said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the small space between them. "You, Adelaide, are very much alive. That is what terrifies them. They expected a ruined girl weeping into her pillow, waiting for a ship to take her back to the colonies. Instead, they found a woman who has taken up residence in the heart of Mayfair, under the protection of the most dangerous man in England." Adelaide turned to face him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The library was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the sharp, clean scent of his sandalwood cologne. "They are saying I lured you. They are saying I staged the accident to trap you. Henry's cousins are at the clubs right now, telling anyone who will listen that I was so desperate for a title that I forced my way into your carriage." Sterling's jaw tightened, the smooth line of his face sharpening with a sudden, brutal honesty. He set his glass down on a nearby table and stepped even closer, invading her personal space until she was backed against the mahogany shelves. Let them talk. Let them invent their little fictions. The truth is far more scandalous, isn't it? He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face before his thumb traced the line of her jaw. His touch was light, but the intensity in his blue eyes was heavy, almost suffocating. "The truth is that I didn't want to let you out of that carriage. The truth is that for the first time in 37 years, I found a woman who didn't shrink when I looked at her. A woman who is substantial in mind, in heart, and in form. They call you a dollar princess because they can only understand your value in gold. I see you, Adelaide, and I haven't been able to think of anything else since the moment I saw your face in that fog. The high stakes of the moment felt like a physical weight. This wasn't a game for him anymore. The wicked Earl was gone, replaced by a man who was looking at her with a raw, intimate hunger that had nothing to do with social chess and everything to do with the woman standing in front of him. Adelaide felt the urge to pull him closer, to bridge the tiny gap between them and find out if his lips were as sharp as his wit. "If I stay," she whispered, her voice breathy and vulnerable, "there is no going back. If we walk into that ball together, I'm choosing a life of whispers. I'm choosing you over everything I've ever known." Sterling's hand moved to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the auburn hair he had admired since their first meeting. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Then choose it. Choose the whispers. Choose the fire. Because I promise you, Adelaide Munro, by the time I'm finished with the Ashcombes, they won't be whispering about your reputation. They will be whispering about how they were foolish enough to let a queen walk out of their lives." The sound of a carriage door slamming outside broke the spell, but the look in Sterling's eyes didn't waver. He was asking her to gamble her entire life on a man the world called a devil. Adelaide looked at the shredded remnants of her letter to her father, still sitting in the wastebasket across the room, and realized she had already made her choice. She wasn't an American fleeing a rejection anymore. She was a woman preparing for a war she intended to win, beside a man who looked like he would burn the world down just to see her smile. As he finally stepped back, leaving her cold in the wake of his heat, he adjusted his cuffs with a return of his bored, aristocratic mask. "Wear the emerald silk tonight, Adelaide. We are going to the opera. I want the ton to see exactly what they are missing before we deliver the final blow at the Ashcombe ball." He turned and walked toward the door, but paused with his hand on the brass handle. "And Adelaide, do not look so worried. You are made for the spotlight. Some people are meant to be background characters in life. You, however, were built to be the entire play." The door closed behind him, leaving Adelaide alone in the library with the sound of her own frantic pulse and the realization that while she had come to London to find a husband, she had accidentally found a soulmate who saw her exactly as she was and wanted more. The Royal Opera House was a cathedral of judgment, draped in crimson velvet and lit by 1,000 flickering gaslights that made the diamonds of the elite sparkle like cold, hard eyes. As Adelaide stepped out of the carriage, the air was crisp, but the atmosphere inside the lobby was stifling. She could feel the weight of the emerald silk against her skin. The gown was heavy, structured, and unapologetically bold. It didn't try to hide her curves. It celebrated them, pulling tight at her waist and flowing into a train that demanded a wide path. Beside her, Sterling looked like a study in lethal elegance. His black evening clothes were a stark contrast to the vibrant green of her dress, and as he offered his arm, his fingers pressed firmly against hers. It wasn't a gentle gesture. It was a tether. "Breathe, Adelaide," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "You are the most beautiful woman in this building. If you act as though you know it, they will have no choice but to believe it." "They aren't looking at me because I'm beautiful, Sterling," she replied, her voice low and raw with honesty. "They are looking at me like a specimen under a microscope. I can hear the whispers from here. The American, the one from the carriage." "Good," Sterling said, his sharp features softening for a fraction of a second as he looked down at her. "Let them look. Let them strain their necks. You aren't a specimen. You're an event." They began the long walk toward the Gillingham box. Every head in the lobby turned. Fans stopped fluttering. Conversations died mid-sentence. Adelaide kept her chin tilted high, her light blue eyes fixed forward. She felt substantial, not in the way the Ashcombes had meant it as an insult, but as a force of nature. She was a Munro, and for the first time she felt the sheer power of her own father's wealth and her own inherent strength combined into a single, sharp edge. Halfway up the grand staircase, they hit the first blockade. Henry Ashcombe stood there, flanked by two of his cousins. He looked smaller than Adelaide remembered, thinner, paler, and infinitely more pathetic in his stiff white tie. When he saw Adelaide, his eyes widened, flickering from her auburn hair to the low-cut neckline of the emerald silk. "Miss Munro," Henry stammered, his face flushing a dull red. I'd heard you had remained in London, but I didn't believe that I would be capable of standing on my own 2 feet without your family's permission." Adelaide cut him off. Her voice was straightforward and brutal. "You should have more faith in American engineering, Henry. We build things to last." Sterling stepped slightly forward, his presence suddenly suffocatingly dominant. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave Henry was one usually reserved for a particularly annoying insect. "Ashcombe," Sterling drawled, the name sounding like a slur. "I believe you're blocking the lady's path. Unless you intend to apologize for your family's lack of hospitality, I suggest you move." Henry's cousins bristled, but Henry himself looked as though he wanted to sink into the floorboards. "I only meant to say that the rumors about the carriage, they're quite scandalous, Sterling. People are talking." "Let them talk," Sterling said, his grip on Adelaide's arm tightening possessively. "They've had nothing worth talking about until tonight. Now, if you'll excuse us, the overture is beginning, and I find I have a very low tolerance for background noise." As they brushed past the Ashcombes, Adelaide felt a surge of cold, exhilarating triumph. She didn't look back. She followed Sterling into the dim intimacy of the Gillingham box, where the dowager sat waiting, her opera glasses already trained on the crowd below. "You made an entrance," the dowager noted, a ghost of a smile on her thin lips. "Henry Ashcombe looks as though he's about to have a fit of the vapors." Adelaide sat down, the emerald silk rustling around her. She looked out over the sea of faces in the pit, all of them still tilted up toward their box. The high stakes of the evening were clear. She had officially declared war on the ton's expectations. But as she felt Sterling settle into the chair beside her, his knee accidentally brushing against hers in the tight space, the social war felt secondary to the storm brewing between the two of them. In the shadows of the box, away from the prying eyes of the crowd, Sterling reached over and took her hand. He didn't hold it like a gentleman. He interlaced his fingers with hers, a raw, intimate gesture that made the music of the orchestra fade into the background. "You did well," he whispered, his face so close she could feel the heat of his skin. "I don't want to just do well, Sterling," Adelaide whispered back, her heart racing. "I want to win." Sterling squeezed her hand, his eyes dark with an intensity that promised she would never have to fight alone again. "Then we win. But remember, Adelaide, once the curtain falls on this performance, the real scandal begins. The Ashcombes won't let this go. They'll come for your name next." Adelaide looked at the man who had become her anchor in the middle of a social hurricane. She realized then that she didn't care about her name anymore. She cared about the way his thumb was tracing circles on the back of her hand, and the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. The first notes of the soprano's aria soared through the house, but Adelaide's world had narrowed down to the man beside her, and the realization that the greatest danger wasn't the tone. It was the fact that she was falling in love with a man who had only ever promised her a masterpiece. The morning following the opera was not met with the quiet satisfaction of a victory, but with the sharp, cold sting of a counterattack. By noon, the Morning Post had published a blind item so thinly veiled that it was practically transparent, suggesting that a certain overseas fortune was attempting to buy its way into a noble lineage through nocturnal entrapment in a carriage. The Ashcombes weren't just whispering anymore. They were trying to incinerate Adelaide's reputation to ensure no other family would touch her father's money. Adelaide sat in the Gillingham library, the newspaper crumpled in her lap. The raw, intimate safety she had felt in the opera box was gone, replaced by a brutal honesty. She was a woman in a foreign land, and her only weapon was the very thing they mocked her for, her substantial American reality. "They think they can starve me out of London," Adelaide said, her voice low and tight. She didn't look up as Sterling entered. She could hear his footsteps, steady and sure, crossing the room until he stood directly behind her chair. "They think you are a girl who plays by their rules," Sterling replied. He reached down, his hands resting on her shoulders. The heat of his palms seeped through her day dress, a grounding force in the middle of the storm. They think if they ruin your name, you will crawl back to New York and leave your father's gold for them to pick it like crows." Adelaide stood up, turning to face him. Her light blue eyes were no longer clouded with hurt. They were flashing with the cold, hard logic of a Monroe. "My father didn't build a railroad empire by crying over bad press. Sterling. He built it by owning the ground the tracks were laid on." She walked to her writing desk and pulled out a heavy parchment she had received via a private courier an hour earlier. "I spent the morning sending cables to New York. It turns out being substantial has its advantages. My father doesn't just have money, he has a memory. And he remembers exactly which London banks the Ashcombes have been begging for extensions." Sterling's brow arched, a look of genuine high-stakes interest sharpening his features. And, Adelaide said, a slow, dangerous smile touching her lips. "It appears that as of 4 o'clock yesterday, the Monroe Investment Group has purchased the primary debt of the Ashcombe estate. Henry doesn't just owe the banks anymore. He owes me." Sterling let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure triumph. He stepped into her space, his blue eyes raking over her with an intensity that made her breath stall. He didn't look at her as a social project or a curiosity. He looked at her as an equal. "You didn't just stay to win the season," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "You stayed to buy the board. I told you, Sterling, I don't fit the mold of a fragile lady." She reached out, her fingers curling into the lapel of his coat, pulling him closer until the air between them was electric. "I'm a Monroe. When we are rejected, we don't flee. We take over." The intimacy of the moment was raw, stripped of the ton's polished lies. Sterling's hand came up, his fingers tangling in the auburn hair at the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her throat. The stakes had shifted from a social game to a soul-deep connection. He wasn't just her ally, he was a man who was realizing that the woman he had tried to save was more powerful than he had ever imagined. "The Ashcombe ball is tonight," Sterling murmured, his voice a low vibration against her lips. "They think they are hosting a funeral for your reputation. They have no idea that the woman walking through their doors is actually their landlord." "I want them to feel it," Adelaide whispered. "I want them to see me in the emerald silk, and I want them to know that every candle in their chandelier and every drop of wine in their glasses belongs to the unsuitable woman they threw out into the rain." Sterling's grip on her tightened, his eyes darkening with a hunger that was no longer about the game. He leaned down, his mouth brushing against hers in a kiss that was a declaration of war and a promise of something much deeper. It was a kiss that tasted of coal smoke, sandalwood, and the brutal, honest truth of two people who had finally found their match. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. "Then let's go, Adelaide. Let's go show them exactly what happens when you try to break a woman who was built to endure." As they left the library, Adelaide felt the weight of the parchment in her hand. She wasn't just going to a ball, she was going to a reckoning. The Ashcombes had rejected her because they thought she was too much to handle. Tonight, she was going to prove them right. The carriage ride to the Ashcombe estate was silent, but it wasn't the cold, calculated silence of their first meeting in the fog. This was a heavy, intimate quiet, thick with the things they weren't saying. Adelaide sat across from Sterling, her emerald silk skirts shimmering in the rhythmic flicker of the passing street lamps. She was focused on the parchment in her reticule, the proof that she owned the very roof they were about to step under, but she could feel Sterling's gaze on her. It was a physical weight, constant and unyielding. Sterling wasn't looking at her dress. He wasn't looking at the jewels the dowager had lent her. He was looking at the way she clenched her jaw when she was nervous, and the way her light blue eyes turned a darker shade of slate when she was thinking about her father. "You're doing it again," he said softly. His voice lacked its usual aristocratic edge. It sounded raw, almost vulnerable. Adelaide looked up. "Doing what?" "Calculating." Sterling leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. The sharp features of his face were softened by the shadows of the carriage. You've turned your heart into a ledger, Adelaide. You think that because you've bought the Ashcombes' debt, you've protected yourself from the sting of their words. But I can see the girl who walked out into the rain still hiding behind that emerald silk. Adelaide pulled her gaze away, staring out the window at the dark English countryside. I have to be a ledger, Sterling. In New York, in London. A woman of my presence doesn't get to be a poem. I'm a business transaction. I always have been. Not to me. The words were simple, straightforward, and utterly devastating. Adelaide turned back to him, her breath hitching. Sterling moved from his seat to hers, the carriage swaying as he settled beside her. The space was cramped, her full figure pressing against his lean frame, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her, his shoulder braced against hers. "I started this because I was bored," Sterling whispered, his confession sounding like a prayer in the dark. "I wanted to see the Ashcombes crawl. I wanted a scandal to liven up a dull season. But somewhere between that ditch and the opera, I stopped caring about the game." He reached out, his hand covering hers. He didn't just hold it. He squeezed it, his fingers searching for the pulse at her wrist. "I look at you, Adelaide, and I don't see a dollar princess. I don't see a substantial problem to be solved. I see the only person in this God-forsaken city who actually says what she means. I see a woman who makes me feel like I'm finally awake after a 20-year sleep." The honesty was brutal. It was the soft fall, the sound of a man's pride hitting the floor. Sterling, the man who had spent his life leading the orchestra, was finally admitting he had lost the beat. His thumb traced the back of her hand, a slow, intimate motion that made the high stakes of the night feel even more dangerous. This wasn't just about a ball anymore. This was about whether or not they could survive the truth of each other. "If you go through with this tonight," Sterling said, his eyes searching hers, "the Ashcombes will be destroyed. But the world will also know that you and I are linked, not just by a carriage ride, but by choice. I'm a man of many sins, Adelaide. Are you sure you want to be the one to carry them?" Adelaide looked at the man beside her, the Earl who had identified her by a crest and saved her with a dare. She saw the cracks in his armor, the raw need for something real in a world made of lace and lies. She reached up, her fingers grazing his smooth jawline, feeling the heat of his skin. "I've spent my life being told I'm too much, Sterling," she whispered, her voice a low, intimate promise. "I think I'm exactly the right size to carry whatever you have to give me." Sterling closed his eyes for a moment, his forehead dropping to hers. The soft fall was complete. He wasn't her protector anymore. He was her partner. The carriage slowed as they turned into the Ashcombes' long, winding drive. The house was ablaze with light, music spilling out onto the lawn where she had once stood in the rain, feeling small and rejected. "The debt is in your bag," Sterling said, pulling back and resuming his mask of cool authority, though his eyes remained warm. "But the power is in your hands. Shall we go and show them who really owns the harmony of this house?" Adelaide straightened her emerald skirts, the parchment crinkling in her grip. She wasn't just a rejected bride. She was a Monroe. And as she stepped out of the carriage on the arm of the Earl of Sterling, she knew that tonight the Ashcombes wouldn't just be losing their money. They'd be losing their pride to the woman they weren't smart enough to keep. The Ashcombe ballroom was a sea of pastel silks and hushed tones, a place designed for delicate women and the men who preferred them. When the footman at the top of the stairs announced the Earl of Sterling and Miss Adelaide Monroe, the music didn't stop. It faltered, like a heartbeat skipping. Adelaide stood at the top of the staircase, the emerald silk of her gown glowing under the massive crystal chandeliers. Beside her, Sterling didn't look like a man entering a den of enemies. He looked like a man who had just been invited to his favorite sport. There was a buoyancy in his step, an unmistakable spark of excitement in the way he adjusted his cuffs. He was grinning, not a polite social smile, but the grin of a man who was about to set a fire and had brought the matches himself. "Look at them, Adelaide," Sterling whispered, his voice light and full of a boyish, infectious energy. They're staring at us like we've just brought a thunderstorm into their perfectly manicured garden. Isn't it wonderful?" Adelaide felt the heat of his excitement, and for the first time, her own nerves began to melt into a cold, sharp thrill. "They think I'm here to beg for a second chance, Sterling." "Then let's show them you're here to collect interest," he replied, his eyes dancing with mischief. He led her down the stairs, his movements fluid and filled with a restless, joyous energy. He wasn't just walking, he was practically vibrating with the fun of the scandal. As they reached the floor, the Ashcombes approached. Henry looked ill, his face a shade of grey that matched his waistcoat. His mother, Lady Ashcombe, stood beside him, her lips pressed into a thin, white line of pure vitriol. "Miss Monroe," Lady Ashcombe said, her voice dripping with ice. "We had assumed you were halfway to New York by now. It seems your sense of propriety is as expansive as your figure." The room went silent. It was the same insult that had broken Adelaide days ago. But this time, Sterling didn't wait. He let out a short, delighted laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "Propriety, Lady Ashcombe," Sterling said, his tone buoyant and teasingly sharp. "I find propriety is usually the refuge of people who have nothing more interesting to offer. And as for Miss Monroe's figure, I've found it to be the only thing in this house worth looking at. It has substance. It has weight. Unlike your family's credit, which I hear is currently lighter than a dandelion seed." Henry stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Sterling, this is my home. You cannot come here and—" "Actually, Henry," Adelaide said, her voice straightforward and brutally honest, "that is where you are mistaken." She reached into her reticule and pulled out the heavy parchment. She didn't hand it to him. She held it up so the light of the chandeliers hit the bank's official seal. "I didn't come here for your aesthetic harmony, and I certainly didn't come for an apology." She looked at Henry, really looked at him, and realized she felt nothing but a distant, cold pity. "I came because my father's bank now holds the mortgage on this estate. Every brick, every silk curtain, and every drop of this mediocre champagne belongs to the Monroe Investment Group." The buoyancy in Sterling's expression shifted. He stepped closer to her, his shoulder brushing hers, his face lit with a raw, intimate pride that made Adelaide's heart swell. He wasn't just having fun anymore. He was looking at her like she was the most magnificent creature he had ever encountered. "You see, Henry," Sterling added, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum that carried across the quiet ballroom, "Adelaide doesn't just take up space. She owns it. And as your new landlord, I believe she'd like the orchestra to play something a bit more substantial." The high stakes of the night had reached their peak. The Ashcombes stood paralyzed, their social mask shattered by the reality of their own ruin. But for Adelaide, the victory wasn't the parchment in her hand. It was the way Sterling was looking at her, with a joy so deep and a devotion so raw that she finally understood what it meant to be seen. "Dance with me, Adelaide," Sterling whispered, his eyes bright with an excitement that had nothing to do with the Ashcombes and everything to do with her. "Let's show them how a landlord and an earl waltz." As the orchestra began a sweeping, defiant melody, Sterling took her in his arms. He didn't hold her like a fragile lady. He held her firmly, his hand flat against her back, pulling her close enough that she could feel the frantic, excited thrum of his heart against her own. They spun into the center of the room, a whirlwind of emerald silk and black wool, leaving the Ashcombes standing in the wreckage of their own pride. The air in the Ashcombe gardens was cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom they had just set on fire. Adelaide walked along the stone path, the heavy emerald silk of her skirts whispering against the boxwood hedges. She could still feel the vibration of the waltz in her bones, but more than that, she felt the weight of Sterling's presence behind her. He wasn't strolling, he was prowling. That earlier buoyancy, that boyish excitement at seeing the Ashcombes ruined, had settled into something far more concentrated, something dangerous. "You're very quiet for a woman who just bought a dukedom's worth of pride for the price of a few banknotes," Sterling said. He stepped up beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets, his sharp features illuminated by the silver glow of a Victorian moon. Adelaide stopped near a fountain, the water trickling like a secret. "I was thinking about the letter I tore up, the one telling my father I was coming home because I didn't fit." She turned to him, her expression raw and stripped of her landlord mask. "I fit here tonight, Sterling, but I fit because I own the room. What happens when the music stops? What happens when we aren't at war with the Ashcombes anymore?" Sterling stepped into her space, his shadow falling over her, making her feel small yet completely seen. He reached out, his fingers grazing the emerald silk at her shoulder before sliding up to cup her jaw. His touch wasn't tentative. It was a claim. "You think I want you because you're a Monroe, or because you're rich enough to buy my debts?" He let out a soft, huffed laugh, his blue eyes burning with a brutal honesty. "Adelaide, I have enough gold to pave the road to New York. I don't need your father's banks. I need the woman who looked at a man she was supposed to marry and told him his harmony was a lie. I need the woman who stood in a muddy ditch and called me condescending." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The excitement was still there, but it had turned into a high-stakes desperation. "I've spent 37 years bored to tears by women who try to be less so they can be ladylike. And then you arrived. Substantial, brilliant, defiant. You didn't just take up space in my carriage, Adelaide. You took up space in my chest, and I don't think I can breathe without you anymore." Adelaide's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the Colleen Hoover moment, the raw, everyday language of a man who was finally, painfully honest. "You're an Earl, Sterling. You could have anyone. Why the American everyone is whispering about?" "Because the whispers are the only thing in this city that sound like the truth when they're talking about you," he whispered. He dropped to one knee, not with the stiff formality of a Victorian gentleman, but with the sudden, heavy grace of a man who was falling. He didn't pull out a ring. He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. "I'm not proposing a marriage of convenience, and I'm certainly not looking for a doll for my mantle. I'm proposing a merger. You bring the fire, and I'll bring the matches. We'll be a scandal. We'll be a legend. But mostly, we'll be together." He looked up at her, his smooth jaw set. "Will you stay, Adelaide? Not for revenge. For me." Adelaide looked down at him, the wicked Earl who had become her partner in crime. She felt the tears prickling her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was too much. She felt like she was exactly enough. "I think," she whispered, her voice breathy and full of a new, fierce joy, "that I have decided to cancel my trip to New York. I find I have a great deal of business to attend to here. Starting with you." Sterling stood up, his face breaking into that triumphant, buoyant grin again. He didn't wait. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, a kiss that was straightforward, brutal, and deep, tasting of moonlight and the future. The aftermath of the Ashcombe ball was a quiet sort of carnage. Within a week, the hawk had officially fled the nest. Henry and his mother had retreated to a small, drafty cottage in Wales, their pride in tatters and their debts held firmly in the silk-gloved hands of the woman they had dared to call unsuitable. London society, always eager to worship at the altar of power, had pivoted overnight. Adelaide Monroe was no longer a dollar princess to be pitied. She was a force to be reckoned with. 6 months later, the doors of Sterling House swung open for the first great event of the season. Adelaide stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the polished mahogany railing. She wasn't wearing emerald tonight. She was in a gown of heavy, midnight gold brocade that caught the light of the gas chandeliers, emphasizing the striking light blue of her eyes and the full, commanding curves of her figure. She looked like a woman who didn't just inhabit a room. She anchored it. "Are you ready to give them something to talk about for the next 40 years? Sterling appeared at her side, looking every inch the Earl. His auburn hair was impeccable, styled with that signature deep side part, and his clean-shaven jawline was as sharp as the wit he'd used to dismantle the Ashcombes. He looked at Adelaide with that same buoyant, excited spark in his eyes. But beneath it was a raw, settled devotion that made her breath hitch every time he caught her gaze. "I think they've had enough scandal for 1 year, Sterling," Adelaide teased, though she leaned into him, her shoulder brushing his. "Nonsense," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate vibration. "A scandal is only a scandal until it becomes a legend, and we, my dear, are officially a legend." He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in that straightforward, possessive way he had. He didn't care who was watching from the foyer below. He didn't care that the gossips were already noting the way he looked at her. "My father is arriving tomorrow," Adelaide reminded him, her heart skipping a beat. "He's bringing the rest of the Monroe fleet with him. Are you sure you're ready for an American takeover of your life?" Sterling laughed, a joyous, free sound that echoed through the hall. He turned to her, his expression turning serious for a heartbeat, his blue eyes searching hers with a brutal honesty. "Adelaide, my life didn't start until you crashed into it in the middle of a fog. I don't want a takeover. I want a partnership. I want every substantial, brilliant, beautiful inch of you, every single day for the rest of my life." He leaned in, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. "The Ashcombes thought you were too much. I think they were right. You are too much for a small man. But for me, you're exactly the right amount of everything." Adelaide smiled, a real radiant smile that had nothing to do with banknotes or social victories. She looked down at the ballroom, filled with the very people who had once whispered about her. She realized she didn't feel the need to shrink or apologize. She was a Monroe, she was the Countess of Sterling, and she was home. As the orchestra began the first notes of the evening's waltz, Sterling led her down the stairs. They didn't move like people who were afraid of judgment. They moved like owners of the earth. Every eye in the room followed them, but Adelaide only had eyes for the man beside her, the Earl who hadn't tried to change her, but had simply built a bigger world for her to live in. The music swelled, the gold of her dress shimmering like a sunrise, and as they stepped onto the dance floor, the whispers of the ton finally went silent. There was nothing left to say. The dollar princess had become a queen, and the wicked Earl had finally found a reason to stay.